Old Hollywood, the golden age of cinema, where legends were born and silver screens sparkled with stars whose names still echo through film history. But behind the glamour, not every icon lived up to their reputation when it came to raw talent. While some actors were worshipped for their beauty, charm, or sheer star power, others stumbled through lines, froze under pressure, or simply coasted on their looks. Today, we're peeling back the glittering curtain to reveal 25 old Hollywood stars who, despite their fame, were often criticized as some of the worst actors of their time. You might recognize the faces, but what you'll discover might just change how you see them forever. And trust us, by the end of this list, you won't believe who made it. Johnny Weissmuller, the man who could swing but not speak. There's no denying Johnny Weissmuller was a spectacle. With a chiseled physique, Olympic gold medals, and the most iconic jungle yell in cinema history, he was Tarzan to generations of moviegoers. But when it came to delivering dialogue, let's just say, the vines weren't the only thing he struggled to hold on to. Weissmuller wasn't cast for his emotional depth or range. He was cast for his body, his presence, and the primal appeal of a man who looked like he was raised by apes. And the studios knew it. His lines were minimal, his expressions stiff, and often his scenes relied more on grunts and stares than anything approaching real acting. Yet somehow, audiences adored him. The myth of Tarzan became so strong, it carried Weissmuller's career through more than a dozen jungle epics where he barely had to emote at all. But here's the irony. While Hollywood moved toward more complex storytelling and characters, Johnny's performances stayed rooted in the jungle, simple, unchanging, and emotionally flat. Even when he moved on from Tarzan, he was often recast in similar strong silent type roles that demanded very little in the way of actual acting. Critics noticed. Fellow actors noticed. But it didn't seem to matter. He became a legend for what he was, not for how he performed. And that's why Johnny Weissmuller tops this list, not as a failure, but as a shining example of how charisma can sometimes shout louder than talent. Maria Montez, the queen of Technicolor and theatrical excess. Maria Montez didn't walk onto the screen. She arrived. Draped in jewels, wrapped in silks, eyes burning with an intensity that defied subtlety, she ruled the exotic fantasy films of the 1940s like a goddess descended from a studio backlit. But while her image was unforgettable, her acting was, well, unforgettable for other reasons. Known as the Queen of Technicolor, Montez dazzled in titles like Arabian Nights and Cobra Woman, films bursting with color and spectacle. But when the dialogue started, the illusion often cracked. Her line delivery was famously over the top, delivered with a kind of wide-eyed theatricality that felt more at home on a high school stage than a Hollywood set. Every emotion was dialed to 11, every gesture exaggerated as if the audience was watching from the back row of an opera house. And yet, that was precisely what made her a cult icon. She wasn't trying to act with nuance, she commanded attention, almost daring the viewer to look away. It worked for a time. The escapism of World War II cinema welcomed her brand of campy exoticism, and Montez leaned into it with full conviction. But outside of those lush Technicolor fantasies, she struggled. Serious roles eluded her. Critical praise never came. And as cinematic tastes evolved, her style quickly became a relic of a more melodramatic era. Maria Montez was never subtle, never restrained. But in being so unapologetically herself, she carved a place in film history, for better or for far too much. Victor Mature, Hollywood's reluctant leading man. Victor Mature had the kind of face that lit up a movie poster and a name that sounded carved in stone. He looked like he was born to play heroes, warriors, and biblical giants. And in a way, he did just that. But behind that square jaw and commanding presence was an actor who never really believed in his own myth, and critics were quick to agree. Mature rose to fame in the 1940s and 50s with epic roles in films like Samson and Delilah, The Robe, and Demetrius and the Gladiators. On screen, he was tall, intense, and seemingly invincible. But off-screen, he was refreshingly candid, almost too candid, about his limitations as an actor. He once quipped, "I'm no actor, and I've got 64 pictures to prove it." That line, half joke and half confession, would follow him for the rest of his career. His performances were often labeled wooden, his emotions painted with a broad brush. Directors knew what they were getting. Physical gravitas, but not much subtlety. He could brood, he could shout, but inner conflict? Emotional nuance. Those weren't part of his toolkit. And yet, there was a strange charm to his self-awareness. While some stars clung desperately to the illusion of their talent, Mature seemed in on the joke. He played the part because he could, not because he believed he was born to do it. In the end, Victor Mature's greatest performance might have been simply owning the fact that he wasn't much of a performer at all. Sonja Henie, skating through stardom, slipping on script. When Sonja Henie glided into Hollywood, she wasn't just another pretty face, she was a global phenomenon. A three-time Olympic gold medalist and world champion figure skater, she brought a kind of athletic grace that dazzled Depression-era audiences. But while her blades carved up the ice with elegance, her dialogue often landed with a thud. Studios were quick to capitalize on her fame, building entire films around lavish ice skating sequences that showcased her unmatched skill. From 1 in a Million to Thin Ice, Henie twirled, leapt, and sparkled her way through the screen like a living snow globe. But when the music stopped and the talking started, something felt off. Her acting, if you could call it that, often hovered somewhere between stilted and barely there. Lines were recited, not lived. Emotions were suggested, not felt. Yet Henie wasn't aiming for Oscar gold. Her films were pure spectacle, light on plot and heavy on charm. And to her credit, she had immense charm. Audiences loved her, but critics weren't fooled. As the skating novelty wore thin and Hollywood shifted toward meatier roles for women, Henie found herself outpaced by more seasoned actresses. She was a superstar in her own right, just not in the way Hollywood usually defines it. Sonja Henie didn't act her way to fame. She skated there. Graceful on the ice, awkward on the set, she remains a fascinating figure, a symbol of how talent in one arena doesn't always translate to another. George Raft, the gangster who refused to feel. George Raft didn't just play gangsters, he practically invented them. With his cold stare, slick hair, and tough guy swagger, he became one of the defining faces of crime cinema in the 1930s and 40s. But beneath the surface of his menacing glare was a performance style so flat, so emotionally vacant, it often felt like the lights were on, but no one was home. Raft's persona was legendary. He made a career out of playing characters who were quiet, dangerous, and endlessly cool. But there's a thin line between stoic and wooden, and George Raft walked it with every role. He rarely changed expression, delivered lines with the emotional range of a brick wall, and relied so heavily on his tough guy look that he rarely, if ever, showed anything resembling vulnerability. It didn't help that Raft reportedly turned down some of the most iconic roles in film history: Casablanca, High Sierra, even Double Indemnity. Why? Either he didn't see the potential, or he feared playing characters with flaws. In trying to protect his image, he may have accidentally sealed his fate as a one-note performer. Still, for a time, that single note was enough. Audiences loved the mystique, and studios loved the edge he brought to their B pictures. But as the golden age matured, Raft stayed frozen in place, an actor unwilling, or perhaps unable to evolve. George Raft was the original gangster. Just don't ask him to play anything else. Esther Williams, the mermaid who couldn't dive into drama. Esther Williams was a revelation underwater. With the grace of a ballerina and the confidence of an Olympic-caliber swimmer, she turned pools into palaces and synchronized swimming into cinematic spectacle. But when the camera rose above the surface and the dialogue began, the magic often stayed behind in the water. Dubbed America's Mermaid, Williams was the star of an entirely unique genre, lavish aquatic musicals crafted entirely around her aquatic abilities. These films were bold, colorful, and unlike anything audiences had seen. Bathing Beauty, $1 Million Mermaid, Neptune's Daughter, all sparkling showcases for her unmatched elegance in the water. But here's the truth. Hollywood didn't hire Esther Williams to act. They hired her to float. Her performances, while charming, lacked depth. She often delivered lines with the polite cheerfulness of a swim instructor, rarely straying from a narrow, emotional palette. Serious moments fell flat. Romantic tension, tepid, and dramatic stakes were generally drowned beneath the glitter of the next big pool number. To her credit, Williams never claimed to be a great actress. She knew her niche, and she played it better than anyone. But the very thing that made her unique also limited her. When musicals faded and roles demanded more than synchronized flair, she found herself adrift. Esther Williams was a star on her own terms, one who didn't need depth to make a splash. But when it came to acting, her range stayed as shallow as the pools she so elegantly swam in. Jane Mansfield, bombshell with a bang but no bite. Jane Mansfield entered Hollywood like a walking exclamation point, blonde, buxom, and bursting with energy. She was the kind of star who didn't just turn heads, she detonated them. Dubbed the poor man's Marilyn Monroe, she had the curves, the wiggle, and the whispery voice down to science. But when it came to real acting, That's where the glitter started to fall off. Her performances were loud, campy, and dripping with self-parody. Whether she was seducing, pouting, or squealing with delight, everything Jane did on screen was turned up to 11. Subtlety wasn't just missing, it had been locked out of the studio entirely. Films like The Girl Can't Help It and Will Success Spoil Rock Hunter became cult hits, not because of Jane's craft, but because of her caricature. She wasn't playing characters, she was playing Jane Mansfield playing a character. But here's the twist, she knew exactly what she was doing. Jane leaned into the cartoonish version of herself with a wink and a nudge. She understood the power of image and publicity better than most, often outshining her own performances with bold headlines and camera-ready stunts. She was in on the joke, but the joke wore thin. As the studio era shifted, so did the appetite for campy sex symbols with no dramatic chops to back them up. Jane, for all her sparkle, never found her footing outside the bombshell bubble. She lit up the screen, no doubt, but when the lights dimmed, the performance faded fast. Tab Hunter, a face for the spotlight, a voice that faltered. Tab Hunter looked like Hollywood's dream carved out of California sunshine. With golden hair, piercing eyes, and a cleft chin straight from a comic book, he was every studio's answer to teenage desire in the 1950s. But behind the poster boy perfection was an actor who never quite found his voice, on screen or off. Discovered as a teenager and rocketed into stardom almost overnight, Hunter was cast not for his skills, but for his looks. His breakout roles in films like Battle Cry and Damn Yankees drew crowds, but left critics scratching their heads. His delivery was often flat, his timing offbeat, and his emotional range, particularly in dramatic scenes, felt forced and unconvincing. There was a sense that he was always acting, never quite being. Part of the issue was the system itself. Hollywood didn't want Tab Hunter to evolve. They wanted him to smile and sell tickets. And he did for a while. But as audiences matured, so did their expectations. The teen idol era faded, and roles that required gravitas or subtlety revealed how out of his depth he could be. Even in lighter fare, his performances rarely felt lived in. There was charm, certainly, but not much conviction. To his credit, Hunter later found peace outside the studio system and even poked fun at his image in later projects. But during his prime, he was less an actor and more a mannequin draped in stardom, beautiful, iconic, and ultimately hollow on screen. Elvis Presley, the king who couldn't conquer the script. He was the king of rock and roll, a cultural hurricane who changed music forever. But when Hollywood tried to crown Elvis Presley as a movie star, the results were far less revolutionary. Charisma? Off the charts. Screen presence? Undeniable. But acting? That's where the kingdom started to wobble. Elvis didn't just appear in films, he dominated the box office. Movies like Jailhouse Rock, Viva Las Vegas, and Blue Hawaii were commercial gold, crafted almost entirely around his charm and voice. But the roles? Thin, repetitive, and tailored to avoid anything too demanding. Studios didn't want Elvis to act, they wanted him to be Elvis. And so he did, again and again, in nearly identical characters. The misunderstood singer, the lovable rebel, the reluctant hero with a guitar slung over his shoulder. There were glimmers, flickers of something deeper. His early film King Creole hinted at potential. But those moments were drowned in a sea of formulaic scripts and sanitized performances. The more films he made, the more critics noticed the pattern. Elvis wasn't evolving, he was coasting. It wasn't entirely his fault. The Colonel, his infamous manager, kept him on a tight leash, vetoing riskier roles that might have stretched his talent. By the time he wanted to be taken seriously as an actor, Hollywood had moved on. Elvis Presley remains an icon. But on film, he was a superstar trapped in a cage of mediocrity, worshipped by audiences, but rarely respected by critics. John Derek, leading man looks, background actor energy. John Derek looked like he belonged on Mount Olympus. With sculpted features, smoldering eyes, and a presence that could stop traffic, he seemed tailor-made for stardom. And Hollywood agreed, at least at first. But it didn't take long for the cameras to reveal what the posters couldn't hide. Beneath all that beauty, the performances were painfully hollow. Derek was cast in roles that screamed for charisma, epic adventures, romantic dramas, and sword-swinging spectacles. Films like Knock on Any Door, The Ten Commandments, and Rogues of Sherwood Forest offered him the stage, but time and again, he stood there like a man waiting for direction that never came. His delivery was flat, his expression stiff, and his screen presence oddly muted for someone with such commanding looks. The phrase "phoning it in" might be generous. he often felt like he wasn't even in the building. Yet the camera loved him. And so did Hollywood for a while. But as critics pointed out the glaring mismatch between appearance and ability, Derek's acting career quietly faded. What followed, ironically, was a far more interesting chapter. He became a director and shaped the image of his future wife, Bo Derek, with the same glossy, surface-level aesthetic that had once defined his own career. John Derek was the perfect example of Hollywood's enduring illusion that beauty can substitute for talent. But talent has a way of revealing itself, and in Derek's case, it never quite showed up for the audition. Zsa Zsa Gabor, the star who played herself repeatedly. Zsa Zsa Gabor didn't just appear in Hollywood, she performed it. With her dazzling smile, thick Hungarian accent, and endless parade of diamonds, she became a symbol of excess, elegance, and entertainment. But here's the twist. Zsa Zsa wasn't really an actress. She was a persona, one so larger than life that it eclipsed every role she was ever given. Her filmography is surprisingly modest for someone so universally recognizable. Appearances in Moulin Rouge, 1952, Queen of Outer Space, 1958, and a smattering of TV cameos showed that she could hit her marks and say the lines, but she rarely disappeared into a character. In truth, she didn't even try. Whether playing a queen from Venus or a high society darling, Gabor always played Zsa Zsa, fabulous, flirty, and just a little out of place. And that's what made her so fascinating. Critics rolled their eyes, directors gave her easy parts, and co-stars smirked through scenes, but audiences still watched. She had a magnetism that acting school couldn't teach. Unfortunately, it didn't translate to depth. Her characters often felt like cardboard cutouts wrapped in mink, and emotional range was never part of her toolkit. But here's the catch. Zsa Zsa knew exactly what she was doing. She was the brand. The diamonds, the husbands, the quotable sass, they were all part of the act. Acting just happened to be one of the smaller pieces. Zsa Zsa Gabor didn't break the fourth wall. She was the wall, glamorous, polished, and entirely impenetrable. Mamie Van Doren, the bombshell who never exploded. In the 1950s, Hollywood had a clear formula: platinum blonde, pouty lips, hourglass figure. Mamie Van Doren fit the mold perfectly. She was part of the blonde bombshell trinity: Marilyn Monroe, Jane Mansfield, and Mamie herself. But while Marilyn stirred hearts and Mansfield turned heads, Mamie's performances often left viewers wondering if anyone had bothered to give her a script. Mamie's screen career was built on suggestion more than substance. In films like Untamed Youth, Teacher's Pet, and High School Confidential, she played the rebellious sexbot, the misunderstood siren, the overripe teenager in an adult's body. She had the look. She had the attitude. What she didn't always have was the talent to hold the screen once the music faded and the lighting softened. Her delivery ranged from breathy to robotic, with a tendency to overplay even the simplest emotions. And while she was undeniably charismatic, it often felt like she was posing in a scene rather than performing in one. Critics took notice. She was labeled as a Monroe knockoff, and producers often treated her like decoration rather than a serious actress. To her credit, Mamie was in on the game. She later admitted that Hollywood never gave her the chance to show more, and perhaps never wanted to. In another era, she might have surprised people. But in the time she was given, she played the part expected of her, no more and no less. Mamie Van Doren lit up the screen like neon in a noir film, bright, bold, and ultimately flickering at the edges. Troy Donahue, the heartthrob who couldn't break a sweat. Troy Donahue didn't just play the clean-cut all-American boy, he was him. Blonde, tall, and as photogenic as a postcard from 1959, he was Hollywood's answer to the teenage dream. But behind those baby blues and camera-perfect hair was an actor so famously expressionless, it became part of his brand, just not in a good way. Discovered and promoted by Warner Brothers, Donahue was quickly plugged into a pipeline of melodramatic romances and glossy dramas. Films like A Summer Place and Parish launched him into superstardom, but the real acting was happening around him. He had one mode: calm, slightly confused, and unbothered by whatever turmoil the script threw his way. Teenage heartbreak, parental betrayal, war. Troy met them all with the same wide-eyed, vaguely pleasant stare. Critics were relentless. Reviews often focused less on his performance and more on the mystery of how he kept getting cast. Directors reportedly had to work around his limitations, keeping his dialogue minimal and his reactions generic. But the studios didn't care, not while the fan mail poured in by the thousands. To his credit, Donahue never pretended to be something he wasn't. He later admitted he was swept up in the machinery of studio fame, valued more for his looks than his talent. And when the wave of teen idol cinema crashed in the late 60s, his career went with it. Troy Donahue may have graced countless covers and caused 1,000 swoons, but on screen, his performances often had all the intensity of a catalog model on a lunch break. Dolores Del Rio, beauty beyond compare, emotion left behind. Dolores Del Rio was a vision, with features that seemed sculpted from porcelain and a presence so ethereal it could silence a room. She became one of Hollywood's earliest and most celebrated Latina stars. In the 1920s and 30s, she was elegance personified, gliding through silent films and early talkies like a living painting. But somewhere between the costumes, close-ups, and studio-crafted mystique, the acting often got lost. Del Rio's performances were frequently criticized for being emotionally distant, her characters more ornamental than lived in. She commanded attention, yes, but not always connection. In films like Ramona and Bird of Paradise, she was often cast as the exotic beauty, a trope that trapped her in roles requiring grace and allure, but little depth or vulnerability. The lines were spoken, the glances delivered, but the humanity underneath often felt just out of reach. It wasn't entirely her fault. Hollywood in that era didn't want Dolores to act. It wanted her to represent mystery, elegance, the foreign ideal. And she delivered exactly that, film after film. But when critics and peers searched for a beating heart behind the beauty, they often found only technique. Later in her career, she returned to Mexico and finally earned acclaim for more grounded, powerful performances in her native language, roles that hinted at the talent that had been stifled for decades. Dolores Del Rio was an icon before she was an actress. Unfortunately, in Hollywood's golden age, being an icon was often enough. Yvonne de Carlo, glamour in spades, gravitas in short supply. Yvonne de Carlo shimmered on screen like a jewel in a costume trunk, exotic, elegant, and always camera-ready. Best known today for her role as Lily Munster in The Munsters, she first rose to fame in the 1940s and 50s as Hollywood's go-to enchantress in period epics and swashbuckling adventures. But behind the flowing gowns and arched eyebrows, de Carlo's performances often felt as decorative as the sets she stood on. She had presence, no doubt. In films like Salome, where she danced in Song of Scheherazade, she brought beauty and flair in spades. But acting? That was another story. Her line readings were serviceable at best, often leaning heavily on melodrama and theatrical flair. She was the kind of actress who made every sentence sound like it was written in italics, dramatic, drawn out, and slightly removed from reality. Directors saw her as a visual asset, someone who could wear a costume like royalty and deliver just enough performance to keep things moving. But emotional nuance and character complexity? Those weren't part of the package. When cast alongside more dynamic co-stars, she sometimes disappeared into the background, her performances too polished, too restrained, almost afraid to crack the surface. Still, Yvonne de Carlo endured, transitioning to television, cultivating a cult following, and embracing her place in Hollywood history. But for all her beauty and screen presence, she rarely delivered a performance that truly moved people. She was unforgettable to look at, just not always to watch. Tony Curtis, too cool to care, too flat to feel. Tony Curtis had swagger before Hollywood knew what to do with it. With his thick New York accent, matinee idol looks, and a devil-may-care attitude, he became one of the most recognizable faces of 1950s cinema. He had the hair, the smirk, the rebellious edge. But for much of his early career, what he didn't have, according to critics, was depth. He started off as pure studio packaging, handsome, smooth, and safe. Films like Son of Alibaba and The Prince Who Was a Thief gave him top billing, elaborate costumes, and plenty of screen time, but asked very little of him emotionally. His delivery was often monotone, his presence oddly detached, like a man who'd learned how to pose rather than perform. Even his romantic scenes had a mechanical quality, as though the script had instructed him to look passionate, and he simply hit his mark and struck the pose. To his credit, Curtis wanted to be more than just a pretty face. Later in his career, he proved he had real range with standout performances in Sweet Smell of Success and The Defiant Ones, but those were exceptions, not the rule. For years, audiences and critics alike watched him float through scenes with the polish of a star but the soul of a mannequin. Tony Curtis looked like a leading man and moved like a movie star. But early on, when it came time to act, it often felt like he was doing his best impersonation of someone else who already knew how. Jean Peters, the beauty who vanished into the frame. Jean Peters had a face directors loved and an aura that screamed leading lady. Cast opposite major stars like Marlon Brando, Tyrone Power, and Marilyn Monroe, she seemed poised for greatness. Her earthy elegance and natural beauty gave her a quiet strength on screen. But when it came to crafting memorable, layered performances, Peters often left audiences wanting more. Her breakout came in Captain from Castile, and roles in Pickup on South Street and Three Coins in The Fountain cemented her as a dependable studio player. But while the camera adored her, critics often struggled to connect. Her delivery was frequently flat, her characters indistinct, and her emotional range limited. She had presence, but it didn't always translate to personality. What made Jean Peters unique was also what made her forgettable. She wasn't larger than life, nor was she mysterious or volatile. She was grounded, almost too grounded, for a film era obsessed with glamour and extremes. Even in dramatic moments, her reactions could feel muted, restrained, or emotionally unclear. She played it safe, and in Hollywood, safe doesn't always stand the test of time. Later, she famously married Howard Hughes and left Hollywood altogether, adding to her mystique, but also freezing her career in place before it could fully evolve. Some say she might have grown into stronger roles if given the time. But based on what we saw, Jean Peters remained an actress who filled the frame without ever fully taking control of it. She was unforgettable to look at, yet surprisingly easy to overlook. Alan Ladd, the quiet storm that never broke. Alan Ladd was the epitome of cool. Stoic, compact, and intense, he brought a brooding presence to the screen that made him one of the most bankable stars of the 1940s and early 50s. In This Gun for Hire, Shane, and a long list of crime dramas and westerns, Ladd perfected the role of the quiet, reluctant hero. But while audiences were drawn to his mysterious stillness, critics eventually began to wonder, was it mystery or was it a lack of range? Ladd rarely showed emotion, and not just in character. His performances were built on long pauses, piercing stares, and a voice that rarely rose above a murmur. He played pain with silence, love with a glance, and anger with a furrowed brow. The restraint was captivating at first, but as the roles piled up, so did the sameness. Whether he was a gunslinger, detective, or war hero, you could almost predict his every move. It wasn't minimalist acting, it was bare minimum acting. His fans loved the enigma, and for a time, so did Hollywood. But as the industry moved toward rawer, more emotional performances, Ladd's controlled, reserved style began to feel dated. Attempts to push into broader roles rarely succeeded, revealing how tightly he had clung to that singular persona. Alan Ladd was a star built on shadows, silence, and stillness. But eventually the stillness started to look less like power and more like emptiness. Cornel Wilde, the thinker who forgot to feel. Cornel Wilde looked like he had it all. Classically handsome, eloquent, and intelligent, with a sophistication that set him apart from many of his Golden Age peers. He wasn't just an actor, he was also a producer, writer, and eventually a director. But for all his ambition and polish, Wilde's acting often left something essential behind: authenticity. In films like A Song to Remember, Leave Her to Heaven, and The Greatest Show on Earth, Wilde consistently played noble, high-minded men, often trapped in melodramas that demanded emotional weight. But instead of delivering depth, he often gave us performance by numbers, technically correct, emotionally distant. His lines were recited with care, but rarely with conviction. It was as if he understood the mechanics of acting, but not the instinct that breathes life into it. Wilde's voice was smooth, his posture perfect, his gestures measured, but those very qualities became his trap. His performances often felt more like rehearsals than revelations, lacking the fire or vulnerability that make characters memorable. Critics noted it. Co-stars sometimes outshone him. And though he had fans, he never quite cracked into the realm of truly great performers of his era. Ironically, Wilde found greater critical respect behind the camera later in his career, proving he had vision, just not always the ability to embody it. Cornel Wilde was the picture of classic Hollywood refinement. But sometimes refinement is the enemy of realism, and Wilde never quite crossed that line into something raw and real. Glenn Ford, dependable, likable, and just there. Glenn Ford was the kind of actor studios loved. Reliable, good-looking in a boy-next-door way, and capable of carrying a film without causing a stir. From Gilda to The Big Heat to Blackboard Jungle, he starred in some of the most beloved films of the mid-20th century. But peel back the glossy resume, and you find a performer whose talent was often defined more by consistency than by passion or precision. Ford was a master of restraint. Calm under pressure, easy with a line, and never overplaying a scene, he developed a style that was smooth, but also, at times, emotionally sterile. Whether he was facing a femme fatale or a gang of juvenile delinquents, his reactions often felt like placeholders, enough to get the scene done, but not enough to leave a lasting impression. He was always good, but rarely great. Critics sometimes called him too safe, and it's easy to see why. He rarely took risks in his performances, rarely veered into vulnerability, and often seemed more like an observer in his own films than an emotional participant. Even when the stakes were high on screen, Ford's internal temperature rarely rose above a simmer. And yet, perhaps that was the point. Glenn Ford made audiences feel comfortable. But comfort isn't always compelling, and in a town full of larger-than-life figures, he sometimes faded into the background of his own career. A true professional, yes. But artistry? That's where Ford fell short. Clara Bow, the it girl, who lost it when she had to talk. Clara Bow was the original Hollywood it girl, a force of personality so electric that audiences didn't just watch her, they felt her. In the 1920s, she was the face of the flapper generation, bringing a modern sexuality and kinetic energy that lit up silent films like few others ever had. But when the talkies arrived, everything changed, and suddenly, Clara Bow's stardom turned into a cautionary tale. In the silent era, Bow was brilliant. She didn't need dialogue. Her eyes, expressions, and physicality did all the talking. But the second she opened her mouth on camera, something shifted. Her thick Brooklyn accent clashed with the polished tones Hollywood expected. Her performances, once effervescent and natural, suddenly seemed self-conscious, hesitant, and forced. She was no longer the fearless flirt or vivacious heroine. She was an actress caught between two worlds. Technological change exposed her limitations, yes, but it also exposed the industry's ruthless demand for reinvention. Clara's acting style, all big expressions and expressive gestures, didn't translate well to the quieter, more nuanced style required by sound. And emotionally, she struggled behind the scenes, compounding the decline of her screen presence. She wasn't untalented, far from it. But her transition to talkies revealed how much her power had relied on instinct and charisma, not craft or adaptability. And Hollywood, quick to discard what no longer worked, moved on without her. Clara Bow burned fast, burned bright, but when the sound came on, the magic dimmed. Peter Lawford, suave, smooth, and slightly sedated. Peter Lawford had all the trappings of a Hollywood success story. British-born with matinee looks, impeccable manners, and a velvet-smooth voice, he seemed designed in a lab to play polished playboys, gentlemen soldiers, and debonair charmers. He was a Rat Pack regular, a Kennedy in-law, and a red carpet fixture. But put him center stage, and give him something meaningful to do, and you quickly saw the cracks. Lawford was always presentable, but rarely memorable. In films like Good News, Little Women, 1949, and Salt and Pepper, he played roles that required poise and polish, and he delivered exactly that, no more, no less. When the script demanded emotion, he offered posture. When it asked for chemistry, he gave polite engagement. Even in comedies, where timing is everything, his performances often felt as if they were operating on a half-second delay. It wasn't that he was bad, he was just bland. Critics often accused him of gliding through roles, relying on accent and appearance instead of emotional investment. He lacked the edge, the inner life, the spark that elevates a performance from adequate to unforgettable. It's no surprise that he flourished more as a supporting player or ensemble member, where he could complement the energy of stronger personalities, like Sinatra, Davis Jr., or even Dean Martin, without having to carry the emotional weight himself. Peter Lawford looked like the kind of man who'd deliver a perfect performance. But time and again, he proved to be just watchable enough, and never quite worth remembering. Paulette Goddard, sparkle without substance. Paulette Goddard shimmered with old Hollywood allure. Witty, radiant, and armed with a mischievous smile, she became a star at a time when charisma could outweigh craft. As one of Charlie Chaplin's muses, she lit up the screen in Modern Times and The Great Dictator, and carried herself through a string of light comedies and costume dramas with apparent ease. But beneath the charm and sparkle was a performer whose range rarely stretched past the surface. Goddard's performances were pleasant, sometimes even delightful, but they lacked the emotional weight or unpredictability that define enduring screen legends. She was often cast as the spunky ingenue or glamorous socialite, and she fit the part to perfection. But that was the problem. She was fitting in, never transforming. Her line delivery could feel mechanical, her timing just slightly off, her emotions calculated instead of felt. She shone in ensembles, benefited from strong co-stars, and had screen presence. But when asked to carry the dramatic tension of a scene, her performances too often hovered in a safe, watchable middle ground. Critics of the time were polite, but rarely effusive. And today, even with her place in cinema history, she's remembered more for who she worked with, and who she almost married, than for any performance on its own merit. Paulette Goddard had everything a star needed, except the ability to disappear into a role. She was always herself on screen, charming, poised, and somehow always just a little out of reach. John Gavin, a leading man cast in marble. John Gavin looked like he was sculpted for stardom. Tall, dark, and classically handsome, he had the kind of face that belonged on a studio lot in the Golden Age, or on the cover of a mid-century magazine. And Hollywood took notice, casting him in prestige pictures like Imitation of Life, Spartacus, and Psycho. But while his resume glittered, his performances often landed with a dull, echoing thud. Gavin had presence, yes, but presence alone doesn't make a performance. His delivery was often stiff, his expressions muted, and his emotional range limited to the safe, stoic middle. Whether playing a tortured lover or a commanding officer, Gavin frequently came across as rehearsed rather than real. The camera caught every perfect angle of his face, but seemed to miss any spark behind his eyes. Even in Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, a film full of unforgettable performances, Gavin's portrayal of Sam Loomis is widely seen as the weakest link. Surrounded by tension and psychological nuance, he delivered his lines as if reading them off a cue card. Critics noticed, co-stars noticed, and eventually audiences noticed too. Still, he wasn't without ambition. He later served as U.S. ambassador to Mexico, proving he had intellect and dignity, but those qualities never quite translated to screen charisma. John Gavin was the definition of a studio-era leading man, photogenic, composed, and dependable. But when it came time to act, he often felt like a mannequin dressed for a role he never fully inhabited. J.P. Morgan, personality in abundance, performance in absence. J.P. Morgan wasn't born in a movie studio. She'd burst out of a nightclub, microphone first. A successful pop singer in the 1950s, she had pipes, presence, and a boldness that made her a staple of the variety show circuit. But somewhere along the way, Hollywood decided to make her an actress. And that's where the performance started to fall apart. Morgan brought plenty of energy to the screen, but acting? That was never her native language. Her few film appearances, most notably in The All-American Boy and later in offbeat cult fare, like the Gong Show movie, showcased a woman who was clearly having fun, but clearly in the wrong role. Her delivery was jarring, her reactions overcooked, and her grasp of tone wildly inconsistent. Every scene felt like it was teetering between self-parody and sincere confusion. She wasn't afraid to go big, too big often, and it made her magnetic in unscripted environments. But when locked into a character and handed a script, that same oversized personality turned chaotic. She didn't disappear into a role. She swallowed a whole, leaving viewers unsure whether they were watching a performance or a personality hijacking the frame. In the end, J.P. Morgan's true talent was being herself, unapologetically. And while that worked wonders in music and television, in film, it exposed the limits. She closes this list not because she failed at acting, but because she never really started. Hollywood tried to cast her, but Jay only ever played Jay. As we close the curtain on this journey through old Hollywood's most criticized performances, let's take a moment to reflect on something important. Every single name on this list is a legend. Yes, we've had a bit of fun pointing out the flatline readings, the stiff gestures, the scenes that maybe didn't quite land. But flaws and all, these stars helped shape the golden age of cinema. They filled the screens of their time with beauty, energy, and unforgettable presence. Whether their acting was praised or panned, they captured the imagination of millions, and many of them still do. Because being a Hollywood star isn't just about perfect technique. It's about timing, persona, charm, cultural impact. Some of these performers had talent that simply didn't fit the roles they were given. Others had charisma so powerful, it didn't matter whether their acting was refined. They were stars in a time when being a star meant something, and for that, they deserve our respect. This list isn't meant to tear anyone down. It's a celebration of the beautiful imperfection that made the studio era so unique. These actors and actresses were icons in their own right, flawed, yes, but unforgettable. Now I'd love to hear from you. Who surprised you on this list? Who would you add or defend? Drop a comment below. I personally read and respond to each one. Let's have a real conversation, because your voice is a big part of this growing community. If you enjoyed this video and want more deep dives into the fascinating world of classic Hollywood, don't forget to like and subscribe. New videos are posted daily, all dedicated to the stars, stories, and secrets of the silver screen's most glamorous era. Until next time, thank you for watching. Here's to the legends, exactly as they were.